Ben Pollack, welcome to 2020 Revision.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. Now you're the media and digital manager at the Canberra Raiders National Rugby League Club. I guess first of all, can you take us through your 2020 and what's been an unprecedented year for everyone?
Yeah, like you said, no different for me from everybody else. I think everybody experienced some sort of disruption to their life during this year, and we were no exception here at the Raiders. We went through a period there, obviously with the games a little bit up in the air about what was going to happen at the time, and we were the first game to be really affected by it. I think we were on the Friday 6 o'clock game, and we had to wait for Scott Morrison's press conference at 3 o'clock to see if we were actually going to be allowed to have anybody inside the venue. So we all sat around the TV at Raiders HQ waiting for that decision, and then crowds were permitted for that weekend. And then round two, obviously we had games behind closed doors, and we thought that was going to be how the season panned out. And then obviously the game shut down totally after that round. So with that came some really hard decisions for our club management, and that was to predominantly stand down probably about 95% of the workforce and just have one or two people here to keep things running while things were being sorted out. And you know, I was in the group that was told that we wouldn't be around for the foreseeable future until things were sorted out. So for me personally, I was lucky enough to have a connection in the media industry here in Canberra. A really good and up-and-coming media communications company, RD Consulting. Their boss, Colin Anstey, is a personal friend of mine, but also someone that I've worked with along the way over many years. And he had actually a lot of work going on in this space due to COVID and due to some other big projects. So I had a quick chat to him, and I was fortunate enough to pick up some work there and actually take a couple of my team members with me as well. So that gave them an opportunity to keep, income coming in and some work happening during that time.
Yes, I'll declare an interest here. I work with the ABC and obviously the radio part of that and the broadcast, and Ben's a big part of, one of the clubs that we work with closely and have close communication with throughout the NRL season. So in order to sort of get things going, the media manager is the first port of call for a lot of people like myself. And we've got good relationships with the Raiders. And I remember that Friday that you mentioned, driving down there, and the first sort of message that I heard was you on the radio saying we've allowed fans to come in. Take me through it from a club perspective and your relationship with the players and the communication that has to go on. Obviously, when there was a sort of undulating period there where we had to work out what the rules would be, the players had to enter a bubble. There were a number of biosecurity measures that were in place. How did that all affect, I guess, the club in general?
Yeah, well, it was a huge unknown, obviously, when it first all happened, particularly with the players. Obviously, their salary is derived 100% from broadcast revenue. So everybody, all players and football-related staff, their effective wage gets paid by the game through the broadcast deal. So with no broadcast television matches happening across Fox or Nine, then that means that there's no money coming into the game. So there was a real period of uncertainty. And some of that was alleviated in the short term by the announcement by the government that the JobKeeper program would come in, and we sort of were able to communicate to the players that, there would be some sort of revenue coming in for them during this time. However, obviously, Peter V'landys and his team at the NRL Commission did a wonderful job getting the project Apollo up and running, which our CEO, Don Ferner, was a part of. And that was all about getting the game back and getting it back. And they set some pretty ambitious targets. And me, like most people, probably looked at that, I think it was May 29 or something like that, the date where they said, we're going to be back by then. And I think everybody said, well, that's great, but how are you going to do it? Everything in society was completely shut down at the time, and I don't think anybody had any real hope. But thankfully, Peter V'landys and his team were able to to absolutely pull a rabbit out of the hat and pretty much set the standard for what happened over the next 6 months in sport, not only in the country, but also across the globe. So it was really refreshing to see NRL at the forefront of those sort of pioneering to get the game back up and running again. And then obviously that once that date was set, it gave everybody that little bit of stability and knowledge that they knew that they had something to aspire to. And, if that got pushed back a week or two, then that would be okay, because they knew that there was a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. And thankfully the game did start back on that date, and everybody was able to get back to some sort of normality. Although, as you mentioned, there were a lot of restrictions put in place to make that happen. We had what they call bubbles inside the NRL, where the players and football-related staff were under a really strict set of guidelines, more strict than society itself. And when other people were starting to be allowed to go back into cafes and bits and pieces like that, then the players and the staff weren't. They had to continue to live in these bubbles and effectively could only go to either training or to play matches. And that was pretty much their life for the whole season. So, you have to give those guys credit for the amazing, sacrifices that they undertook during that period.
Now, one of the things that you do, obviously, and you do it very well, is get your players in the media and get them exposure, which in turn, I guess, acts as a sort of twofold thing. First of all, it allows them to communicate to the fans, and it also allows your club sponsors to get exposure as well. So given those strict biosecurity measures and the bubble that was in place, and you being outside the bubble, take me through the challenges involved in what would be a significantly easier task during normal times than it was during this period of the game.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head. The challenge was the fact that we couldn't have direct communication with players. And early on, with the biosecurity measures and things like that, it was very challenging because we had to try and work out a way to keep people engaged and keep people access to our players and coaches and things like that. So the NRL again worked with clubs, and we all established our own Zoom communications, like pretty much everyone has now. And that sort of led the way in being able to have the players involved. Thankfully for us here at the Raiders, we actually moved into a brand new Centre of Excellence literally 2 weeks before this all sort of happened. So we've got this amazing facility here that's got the capacity to do things that other clubs probably can't. We've got really good player and football related facilities, but we've also got some facilities here that help our space too. We've got our own little media studio where we can set up interviews and things like that. So the building was pretty much split into two designated zones. There was a clean zone and a dirty zone, and people who were inside the bubble could only move within the clean zone, and likewise for people that were in the dirty zone. So people could still come to work as normal, but there was just basically some segregation between the two areas. And then as sort of the season progressed and the protocols relaxed a little bit, we were able to create a neutral zone where we could actually bring players in to an area in our facility and have a sort of a sectioned off area where they would walk in. We would get the media in sort of 15 minutes before any press conferences and have them all set up ready to go. And then the player would come in, do their interview or coach, and then they would leave, and then the media would leave afterwards. So there was never any real direct contact between external people and the people inside the bubble. So for us, that worked really well. And, this day and age, I remember a time when I first started where, you'd have 5 or 6 TV cameras coming to every press conference and, half a dozen journos as well. But in this day and age, due to not only budget cuts, but also some technology, we're able to actually film those press conferences internally and then distribute those to those people who want them. So as you mentioned before, it's a free kick for our sponsors and our brand exposure if we're being able to provide that service across the major news platforms and give more people some vision on what we do.
And what about the players themselves? I think Canberra were one of the clubs being in a regional area that were probably more affected by the travel, the day in, day out, in and out departure for pre-games and games. So you guys were doing a lot of bus trips back and forth to Sydney and other areas, whereas some clubs were able to sort of fly. So talk to me about how the players and the coaching staff and the people around the footy club were dealing with that kind of situation in combination with the strict measures that were in place every sort of day throughout the season.
Look, we weren't the only club that faced challenges during the year, and you automatically think of the New Zealand Warriors, who pretty much relocated to another country for the entire season. The Melbourne Storm had to do it a few weeks into the competition as well and relocate to the Sunshine Coast. They were a little bit different, that they were able to bring their families and close contacts with them on that trip. For our guys, they were able to go home to their families every night and sleep in their own beds and things like that. But where we were probably disadvantaged from the rest of the competition was, as you said, the travel. So we had to either bus or fly to all of our games outside of Canberra on the day of the match, which is something that's never really been done before. It's usually a trip up the night before or even a couple of days before for some of those longer games. And we actually had the even further disadvantage for the first few rounds where with the strict protocols that were initially put in place, matches were only allowed to be played either in Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. So there was no matches in Canberra. So we had to play our first 2 home games at Campbelltown, which presented its own challenges, not only from a playing perspective, but also from a commercial marketing point of view as well. We had to take all of our own signage, our staff, our whole game day production to a totally different venue 3 hours away. So it was a pretty big burden on everyone at the club at the time, but you can't fault the attitude of the staff and the playing group during that period. They just rolled their sleeves up, got the job done, and then thankfully we're able to come back to Canberra. But as I said, the travel was a real big one for us because, kilometre-wise, if you looked at it from that perspective, the Cowboys and the Gold Coast and teams like that probably did more kilometres. But in terms of travel time, we actually spent more time on buses and in planes than any other team. And I think it was a total of about 50 hours just on travel on game days for the season, compared to a team like some of those teams of Western Sydney that might have done 10 hours travel for the whole season. So it was a disadvantage, but at the same time, Ricky's got a really good attitude towards adversity within this playing group, and they've faced challenges before and they face these ones at the same time.
You touched on the ability for your staff to, I guess, create their own content and distribute it to media outlets. Were some of the other learnings coming out of 2020 for you?
I think some of the big learnings for us were around the responsibility that we have internally to make sure that the club continues to be front of mind for supporters and also potential supporters. Revenue was one thing that was greatly affected for rugby league clubs in 2020, as it probably was for most businesses. Obviously cafes and restaurants and things like that went through a period where they weren't allowed to open at all and had to shut down. And for us, it was things like gate takings, tickets. We were very limited in the amount of tickets we could sell to matches. Memberships, we had to come up with a program to look at either rolling over people's memberships into the next season, or refunding memberships, or people donating their membership money to our foundation to help assist in the club continuing on. So, I mean, that was really encouraging that we had over 90, I think it was 91 or 92% of people went for the options to either roll over or donate. I think we only had about 5 or 6% of people that actually called for their money back, and we were understanding with that decision. But it really gave us a really good sort of understanding of how fragile our industry can be, and if something like this happens again, the repercussions it can have. So from an internal digital media perspective, it was for us, it was about continuing to keep our own internal channels fully serviced and giving that insight that fans probably were lacking a little bit, because obviously media had limited access to our players, and things that we've done in the past weren't able to happen this year. And at the same time, making sure that we continued our presence in the mainstream media. So on any given week, we would have 6 to 7 players involved in either radio interviews or Zoom interviews with broadcast partners, and just being able to keep the Raiders brand and their name out there.
You talked about having to step out for a few weeks while the competition was in shutdown. What were some of the things that you, I guess, learnt from being in a different working environment that you could bring back to your role at the Canberra Raiders?
It was actually really good for me. I think, as I mentioned, I went and worked for a company called RD Consulting, and they are, a real leader in their space. They provide communications consultancy for a number of businesses, and some of their big clients include the Australian Army and Defence and a lot of government departments. And it was really good to go and work with some top level professionals in that industry. As I mentioned, their sort of CEO, Kyle Anstey, is a really experienced operator, and he's got a really strong team of professionals around him. It was really good just to work alongside of those people and bounce ideas off them for certain projects we were working on, and be able to provide some insight and input the other way as well. I think that was really good, and being able to maintain those relationships throughout the course of the season and keep in touch with those people. And that's probably one thing I didn't really appreciate, was how important it is for you to as a leader in our team here at the Raiders, is to make sure that you're keeping on top of those industry trends and what's happening in that space in your business, because you can get a little bit bogged down in the NRL sort of narrative during a season. But it was actually quite refreshing to step outside of that for a short period and learn some new things and some new technologies and techniques that we were able to bring back here. So, and as I mentioned before, we had a couple of our team members who came with me, and they got some experience that they probably wouldn't have got as well. So I found it actually a really productive time, and I didn't use it as a time where I was just going to walk away and do nothing. I wanted to continue to better my skills and then hopefully bring something back to the Raiders.
Now, as we look ahead to 2021, what are you looking forward to the most when that ticks around?
Look, like most people, I'm sort of optimistic that we'll be, going back to some sort of sense of normality in next season, and what those rules and regulations look like. But at the same time, I'm probably open-minded in the fact that there probably will be some initial restrictions and things that we have to face next year, and that's just going to be a continuation of what's happening with the whole COVID situation in Australia and globally. So. We'll be keeping an eye on that and just seeing what happens and what unfolds in that space. And I know that the NRL's already working with clubs on what the pre-season is going to look like, and how clubs are able to sort of have some eased restrictions during that period before it gets to a point where teams are travelling and playing each other, and we've got that risk sort of factor in place. So I think the players will appreciate being able to at least get through to the Christmas break and have some sort of normality in their life before they have to, face those challenges in 2021. But for us, it's just I think 2021 is a real chance to get back and celebrate what a great product we have. I think we all took it a little bit for granted in the lead up to these events, and I think people have been able to step back and say, geez, we've actually got a really good product, and we're actually really lucky to work in the industry we work in. So I think there'll be a refreshed sense of that right across the whole game. And I hope that clubs, players, staff, right from the bottom to the top, can continue to work really hard to promote the game. I would hate this to revert to situations where clubs and players are reluctant to put themselves out into the public and media spotlight, because I think that's a huge part of what we are as a game, is being able to promote and tell those stories. And let's just hope that continues into 2021.
Ben Pollack, thanks for joining me on 2020 Revision.
Thanks, Ralph.